So about the Sustainable Wash Systems Learning Partnership, I think many of you have probably been to other events and webinars and things over the past year, but just to give a brief introduction, under SWS, there are 8 partners who are working with us at USAID to test new ideas, approaches, and tools to strengthen local wash systems in order to improve sustainability. We start with the premise that strengthening a local system means that we need to be engaging with the actors in that system and also understanding and addressing key factors, something, for example, like financing, that can help or inhibit sustainability. And at the same time, SWS partners are working in partnership with local stakeholders in Kenya, Ethiopia, and Uganda to apply and test new solutions for sustaining wash services. Through this partnership, our goal is really to learn, and we're working to better understand how people understand and engage with systems, how we can apply collaborative approaches to reach solutions, and how professionalized maintenance services can help to solve the rural water sustainability challenge. Today's webinar is going to focus on the problem of collective action and specifically how programs can be designed to better achieve progress on complex outcomes that require a lot of actors working together. Next slide. So during today's webinar, we'll first talk a bit about what collective action is and why it's an important and growing approach in the wash sector. We will then present findings from research efforts designed to understand the important elements of a collective action approach and how these can lead to success. Finally, we'll have 3 representatives from our partners working on the ground, and they'll describe how they applied collective action to achieve their goals. We're going to hear from many members of the SWS team today. For this first portion of the webinar, we'll hear from Sean Peabody and Kimmy Pugel. Sean is a senior learning specialist at Environmental Incentives, and he leads the SWS research area on collective action. Kimmy is a civil engineering PhD candidate at the University of Colorado Boulder, and she's the primary researcher for the SWS research area on collective action. So with that, I will hand it over to Sean. Sean, please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Thanks, Liz. Hello, everyone, and again, welcome. So I'm going to give a quick overview of our work before handing over to Kimmy, who will share more about our methods and findings. I need to go to the next slide, please. As we all know, water, sanitation, and hygiene service delivery remains unequal, unreliable, and unsafe for much of the world's population. Many governments, especially in rural areas and small towns, in low and middle income countries, are behind in establishing robust systems and arrangements for wash service provision. Major and systemic challenges such as rapid urbanization, water scarcity, and humanitarian emergencies further complicate reform efforts. And many of these challenges are larger than the mandates and capabilities of any single government or organization. And that creates the acute need for collaborating among the multiple stakeholders, both public, private, in order to strengthen service delivery. So due in part both to recent emergence and inconsistent terminology, collaborative approaches in the wash sector are understudied. Implementers, funders, and participants of collaborative approaches lacked evidence-driven guidance on how these approaches can be designed, what factors support or hinder progress. Next slide, and that's really the gap that we were aiming to try and fill. So our research aimed to build the evidence base on the benefits, costs, and appropriate uses for collaborative approaches. And these are the 3 primary areas of focus for this research. The first is define collaborative approaches in WASH to provide a common frame of reference. Second, which we'll spend most of our time on today, is to investigate the factors and design decisions that drive progress, or lack thereof. And third, which is still underway, and we don't yet have our results, but we will soon, is to capture costs and benefits of different design decisions. And we'll cover that in more depth in a future webinar. Next slide, please. We looked at 11 cases, learning alliances for rural water and sanitation in Ethiopia, learning alliances for rural water and collective impact for national sanitation marketing in Uganda, government partnerships to promote adoption of professionalized maintenance models in Uganda, and a WASH forum to promote adoption of professionalized maintenance models for small pipe systems in Kenya. And then I'd like to take a second to acknowledge that this research is a collaborative effort itself amongst the implementation teams. Tetra Tech, WAVE, Oxford, Rural Focus, Millennium Water Alliance, Sanitation for Health, IRC WASH have all been involved from early stages, have dedicated significant time and effort documenting their cases, participating in interviews, helping us to validate and interpret the results. So this is really a big team effort across lots and lots of people and organizations. Next slide, please. Right, so now I'll give a brief summary of our work to define collaborative approaches in WASH. Next slide. So this is a definition we developed after completing a literature review and an expert panel. And we have more information on this on the SWS collective action page on global waters, which includes a write-up of the expert panel and a brief on this definition. I'll just read this out quickly. We're defining collective action as a process for improving a public service where sectoral stakeholders regularly convene and take joint action to address shared problems, in which problems are complex and solutions require deliberation and action by many actors. Members agree on shared vision and problem definition, and stakeholders clarify responsibilities for service provision and hold each other accountable. Here we've got the fish as a sort of a visual depiction of the definition. And before we move on, I'd just like to note that this definition covers a huge variety of cases. This is one of the biggest surprises, just how different these approaches can look. And there's not one model for collective action approaches. Instead, we saw teams with similar visions for collaboration set themselves up differently and make a lot of unique decisions. So our research is really focused on these differences to try and better understand the drivers behind the decisions and how the combination of decisions and contextual factors affect progress. So on that note, I will hand over to Kimmy. Please unmute yourself and take it away.
Great, thanks, Sean. If you could go to the next slide. Yes, thank you. And then one more. Thank you. Okay, great. So I'm Kimberly Pugel at the University of Colorado Boulder. The second area of learning that we're focusing on in SWS under our collective action work is investigating what factors and design decisions can drive progress. Next slide. The question that we sought to answer was what combinations of factors contribute to progress of collaborative approaches? To answer this question, we collected and synthesized data across 11 cases of collaborative approaches in WASH, including 9 cases from SWS and 2 from outside of SWS. Our data sources included over 100 literature sources, 40 interviews, and 4,000 pages of documentation spanning more than 3 years of records. Using this data, we investigated around 40 factors to understand the role that they played in driving progress. The comparative analysis started by qualitatively coding all documentation and then converting all that information into comparative values in a way that emphasized the key differences between cases. We then synthesized all those comparative values using qualitative comparative analysis, which is a more structured and systematic comparative method than traditional cross-case comparison methods. It uses fuzzy logic and set theory to pinpoint meaningful factors and highlight the most important trends. Our field experts were highly involved throughout the analysis process as well, and you'll hear from some of them later. But we consulted with them regularly, and once we had results, we convened all the field experts together to help the interpretation of the results. Next slide. Before getting into some of those factors, I want to briefly cover how we defined outcomes. So we defined outcomes as the specific activities or action areas decided on by the collaboratives, such as a fecal sludge dumping site or a countywide monitoring database for water infrastructure or a certain policy related to how water is managed. To assess the progress on these outcomes, we assessed two measures. First, we looked at the degree to which the activities were implemented, considering incremental steps toward progress, such as when buy-in is obtained or when resources are mobilized. The second measure was their relative difficulty. If you can click next. We identified 7 aspects of an outcome that would make it more difficult to achieve, including if it was unfamiliar, required widespread change, required policy change, was multifaceted, controversial, or was dependent on stakeholders distributed either horizontally or vertically. So for example, in one town in Ethiopia, implementing a fecal sludge dumping facility was somewhat controversial because there was a long-standing conflict about which entities would be allowed to dump at the facility, and its establishment meant stronger regulation of predominant industries. It also relied on actors from the health office, environmental office, water utility, and sanitation municipality, which meant it was dependent on stakeholders distributed horizontally. So those are just 2 examples of 2 measures that applied to that specific outcome. But despite those challenges and difficulty measures, the case was still able to construct a temporary facility in 2020 and have drafted plans and mobilized resources for the construction of the long-term facility. So that's really what we're looking at. And we combine these 2 measures into a single measure of progress made. So then, through the analysis process, we were really investigating how those 40 factors contributed to this progress on difficult outcomes. Ultimately, we found that 5 factors played a really important role in driving progress on difficult outcomes. Next slide. Since these 5 factors will appear multiple times as I go through the results, I'll take some time now to define these. The definitions for these factors have been pulled together into a handout as a reference, which someone will paste in the chat a link to the PDF, which will have the definitions for these as well as some other factors I'll discuss on the coming slides. But to go through these now for everyone, local government uptake means relevant decision-making entities in the local government take up decisions or recommendations made by the collaborative. So this could include contributing financially or in kind to their activities. It could mean expanding annual government budgets related to the topic or passing policies or resolutions. A hub with convening power, this one actually sort of has 2 definitions within it. So to start, the hub is the entity that manages all logistics, facilitation, leadership, administrative functions of the collaborative. And then specifically, this factor is when that hub entity has significant convening power, which means they have the influence and ability to bring people together for meetings and other activities. We saw that significant convening power sometimes came from a government entity that is not only respected and has decision-making power, but also holds a mandate related to the topic of the collaborative. But we also saw that significant convening power could be gained by the hub if a non-government organization or entity has been working in the area for a really long time and has established working relationships and a lot of respect and influence. So it doesn't necessarily have to be one way that this is achieved. The third factor is collective problem identification, which means that key problem areas that the collaborative will address are defined by the members of the collaborative themselves. This is opposed to if the problem areas are defined before the collaboration starts, and then the collaboration itself is more focused on implementation and action. The next is external funds for activities. This means that funding is available to the collaborative from external sources, specifically for their outcomes and activities. So like that fecal sludge dumping site, a database, policy development, master planning, other types of infrastructure construction as well. And it's really important that it's not just funding meetings or big data collection events, it's the activities themselves. And then finally, we have continuity and accountability, which means that member organizations are consistently sending the right representatives and the members feel accountable to carry out action items that they've been assigned. So ultimately, these 5 factors played a really important role in driving progress in our cases, and they did that in different ways. But before getting into the inner workings of how that happened, I want to cover some important contextual factors and defining characteristics. You go to the next slide. There were 13 factors that didn't actually vary across our cases, so we weren't able to look at the role that they played, but they're really important to acknowledge because they may have helped set the stage for the 5 factors that I just discussed to drive progress. So for example, I just mentioned having a hub with convening power was really important, but that also probably relied on the fact that the hub had adequate staff capacity and facilitation skills, which is one of the factors on the right, hub with capacity. So I'll run through all of these really quickly, just because they're really important to note. These are also all defined on that handout that should be linked in the chat as well. So in all of our cases, members were autonomous stakeholders. Because each of them played a role in either water or sanitation service provision, their roles were somewhat interdependent. Membership was voluntary, but members all had some motivations to attend meetings and carry out action items. Power differences also existed, but members generally did not explicitly leverage them to influence decisions or discussions. In every case, both technical and decision-making government entities were either members of the collaborative or were highly engaged and regularly updated on the collaborative's activities. All of our cases were facilitated transparently by a hub entity with strong capacity. Again, the hub meaning that leading and facilitating organization. Under the guidance of that hub entity, the members reached a common vision and frequently interacted both in and between meetings. All of the cases achieved some small achievements early in the process, and all found ways to adapt their process. So that was a lot of things embedded in this, in these factors, but just as a reminder to help set the stage for what the results that I'll cover next. These really lay the groundwork for those 5 other factors to build on and really drive progress. So let's get into the rest of the results. If you go to the next slide. We had 3 unique pathways or combinations of factors that explained how cases made progress. In the first pathway, progress was made when the hub had convening power, which allowed the hub to rally stakeholders around the effort and strengthen the continuity and accountability of members, which ensured members followed up on the action items they were assigned. Cases established this accountability either through activity tracking, such as an annual work plan, or by progress tracking, such as through agreed performance indicators. But these 2 factors alone were not sufficient for progress. Government uptake was the critical third piece of the puzzle here. Cases that were able to follow this pathway benefited from a stable enough political environment that continuity and accountability could be established. In contexts with high turnover or unpredictable political dynamics, though, it was harder to gain continuity and accountability, but that doesn't mean they weren't able to make progress. They just followed a different pathway. If you go to the next, not slide, but animation. Thank you. In the second pathway, the hub still used their convening power to rally stakeholders around an effort, but faced with an inconsistent membership, they instead focused on securing external funds for activities. This, paired with local government uptake of recommendations, was sufficient for progress. But we saw progress could also be made even if the hub didn't have convening power. If you click next. The third pathway explains how progress can be made when problems are identified collectively by the collaborative and when external funds are secured to fund solutions to those problems. Both of these happened regardless of whether the hub had convening power or not. And again, local government uptake is the final third piece of the puzzle required to make progress. These pathways have a lot of overlaps. So for example, you may have noticed all 3 pathways relied on getting local government uptake. The first 2 relied on having a hub with convening power. Next slide. And it's really the investigation into these overlaps that reveal really important takeaways and trends. So to walk through these trends, I'll display the pathways in this way, which show the overlap between the pathways. Next slide. Local government decision makers taking up recommendations by the collaboratives was the only factor that was absolutely necessary for progress. And this is really important because our cases have demonstrated that it's very hard to secure government uptake. It can be challenged by turnover and shifting priorities come election season or a pandemic, but every effort put towards demonstrating value and establishing legitimacy pays off by helping attain government uptake. And what we've also learned is that government uptake is not always guaranteed. Signing a memorandum of understanding does not guarantee uptake, nor does involving government as members of the collaborative. So this is a really important area for learning. Next slide. Just like was mentioned, back one slide, thank you. Okay, so just like was mentioned in that early poll, establishing a consistent and accountable membership can be really hard, but it can be one critical step towards progress. That aligns with what's generally recommended in guidance for collaborative approaches. But also what we saw is that some of our cases weren't able to achieve a continuous or a consistent and accountable membership. Sometimes because they didn't have that stability. There was a lot of turnover of government staff or shifting priorities due to emergencies. And really that was okay. We had 2 pathways to progress that didn't rely on continuity and accountability to make progress. And so this can definitely be an important pathway, an important step, but it's not always required. Next slide. Those cases that weren't able to achieve continuity and accountability did, however, secure external funds for activities. This does seem to be a viable alternative when continuity and accountability cannot be assured. But again, not all pathways required external funds. So there are ways to make progress even without access to external funding. Next slide. And then finally, the focus of today's discussion and a lot more content and lessons to come is collective problem identification. So just like continuity and accountability, collective problem identification is generally recommended in guidance for collaborative approaches. Some guidance will even say that if you don't do collective problem identification, then technically you aren't even a collaborative approach. But what we saw was that while collective problem identification was critical in some contexts, there are other ways problems can be identified. And that's going to be the focus of the rest of today's discussions. But it was a critical step to progress in one of our 3 pathways. I'll take some questions on these results and pathways in a minute, but before I get there, I want to briefly cover some additional information about collective problem identification to help set the stage for the next discussion, which will feature researchers and experts from the field. If you go to the next slide. We saw 2 main ways that problems were identified: collective problem identification, which I just discussed, and demonstration of a model. Just to help paint the picture of what these look like, in collective problem identification, the members of the collaborative themselves are the ones identifying the problem areas they'll be working on. This requires a lot of time up front. It requires a lot of flexibility on the part of the program funders and partner governments. We did see that often implementers will incorporate systems analyses to support the identification of problems or prioritization of problems when there's too many to really wrap your head around. On the other hand, demonstration of a model means that the broad problem areas are identified before the collaborative is formed. This allows the collaborative efforts to be focused on the action and implementation side of things. Not that collective problem identification doesn't include some work on implementation and action, but just that demonstration of a model this is the focus of these efforts. This approach can provide upfront clarity to program funders and partner governments. it can allow for advanced approval of activity plans, and it can help ensure activities are aligned with government priorities. After we take some questions on the pathways to progress, we'll hear 2 representatives from IRC talking about their experience facilitating collective problem identification. And we'll hear from 1 representative from Fundifix talking about their experience demonstrating a model. And with that, I'll hand it back to Liz Jordan to facilitate our first Q&A section. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Kimmy and Sean, for that great presentation. So we have some time now to take questions before we switch over to hearing from a few more of the partners who've been working on the ground. Please feel free to type questions into the chat, and we'll take them as we go, and we'll do our best to get through as many questions as we can in the time we have today. So I'll start with one that I think is directed at Kimmy from Harold. He's asking, could you please explain more fully what you mean by local government uptake?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I appreciate it because it's just such an important factor. So thanks, Harold. It is a really broad factor. It meant different things in different cases. So at the local level in Uganda, like let's say the district level, it really means that the district council, the chief administrative officer, really important decision makers, if the collaborative were to go to them and say, hey, we think that this is an important area related to water that will really make a difference in this district. We need you to take action on this. At the end of the day, does that district council pass a resolution related to that topic? Do they take up those recommendations? And that's what that really means. It does look different in all levels. So I'm not going to go into all of the details, but sometimes it meant passing certain resolutions. Sometimes it meant shifting some budget allocations so that town in Ethiopia with the fecal sludge dumping site that I talked about, for them it was, will the town administration and the mayor office shift some budget around to allow for some budget line items being allocated for critical parts of the infrastructure, construction and design. And so it ranged and it changes over time. It changes after election season and things like that as well. So it's a great question, and it's actually the topic of local government uptake, because it's been so important in all of our pathways. It's going to be a focus that we'll dive into a lot more depth on in our closeout event, which will be in September. Today, we're focusing mostly on the collective problem identification and the ways that problems can be identified. But in our closeout event, we'll hear from all of our teams and partners about ways that they've established and secured local government buy-in and uptake. And so that will be, we have lots of things we'd love to share with you, but don't have quite the time today to go into. So thank you, Harold.
Great, thanks for that, Kimmy. I think it's important to note that the way you're talking about local government uptake, it really is an accomplishment in and of itself to get that level of buy-in and uptake from a government partner. So glad that you're teasing future results and findings to come out, particularly on that topic and how different coalitions achieved that. Another question that came in from Beverly. Question was, does the legal legitimacy of the conveners or the collaboration mechanism add value? For example, legitimacy provided by legislation. Does that matter in terms of how effective these approaches can be?
Yeah, that's a great point. I can start answering that, and Sean, feel free to jump in. And so, her question was a lot about legal legitimacy, which is a really interesting way of putting it. When the first thing that came to my mind is that hub with convening power factor that fell into 2 of our pathways as being really important for progress. We saw that convening power gained in different ways, but a lot of it was related to legitimacy, demonstrating value, and being seen as a legitimate convener. And sometimes providing, having some form of legal legitimacy is really important for that. Having an institutionalized or a policy, for example, that mandates that this collaborative group is formed. So that's some form of legal legitimacy that we saw some of our teams getting. It does start to overlap into the question I just answered about how do you gain local government uptake. We saw being seen as legitimate, demonstrating value or proof of concept was really important in gaining local government uptake, which again, we won't have as much time as I wish we could have to go into today. But it is that's one way that our teams were able to demonstrate value and gain uptake was through gaining legal legitimacy or other forms of legitimacy. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. Thanks.
Sean, did you want to chime in at all there?
No, I think Kimmy nailed that one.
Great. All right, next question. And this is related, I think, to some of these questions about legitimacy and governance. Did researchers consider corruption and/or poor performing versus good performing local governments? Did you look at that piece of the context and find any differences in how these approaches worked?
Yeah, so I'll just say that it wasn't a focus. I think that you could have endless amounts of studies that could look into some of that. All of our cases had, decently functioning governments that they were mostly facing problems of turnover, shifting priorities, and other political dynamics. But we didn't really get we didn't have a lot of documentation and evidence related to corruption. I think that it definitely would affect things like how government uptake is secured. But we weren't able to look at it. I think that it's a really interesting area to think about for future work. I don't know, Sean, if you have anything to add.
I add something there. Part of what's nice about the collaborative approaches is that the local system actors are the ones taking action. So I think that some of that work, the corruption often I think happens in the spaces where people aren't looking or in areas where there's not as much oversight or where people aren't collaborating. And so I think we don't have evidence of it, but I would expect that through the collaboration, through the better transparency, through the creating a sense of common vision and common work, it might sort of eke out or make the system more conducive towards making progress.
I guess the other thing I would add quickly is that we not as much related to the corruption side of the question, but something more related to the poor performance and just low capacity, lower staff time and resources that local government often faces. We did have that in a lot of our cases. Especially when hub with convening power played such an important role. If the government doesn't have the capacity to serve as the hub, we did have a lot of cases where the non-government organization who was serving as the implementing organization, they actually helped support the government as the hub role. So the implementing organization would perform a lot of the high capacity functions of the hub, whereas the government would then serve more of the convening functions, sending invites, facilitating meetings, but then a lot of the behind the scenes work was done by the implementing organization. So that was something a tactic that our teams used when faced with low government capacity in general for facilitating this type of work.
Great, thanks. And I should note, I know Sean and Kimmy both mentioned where these cases were, but we worked in Kenya, Ethiopia, Uganda. We didn't work in any really highly unstable or conflict areas for this work. So when you talk about good performing, poor performing, we did work in some places that had potentially low capacity at the local government level, but not places where working through that local government would have been truly impossible or very hard to engage. So just keep that in mind in terms of thinking about how this might apply to other contexts. I had one clarifying question that came in about one of the factors, I think to Kimmy. Can you give an example of what you mean by external funding? Is that a grant funding, private sector funding, or government funding?
Yeah, that's a great question. We did, and this looked different in all of our cases. So the example I've turned to a few times now is that fecal sludge dumping site in a town in Ethiopia. So they received funds from a large World Bank project, which was not associated with SWS or the implementing organization's work, but there was a large source of funding that was awarded to the town for sanitation related investments. And then the town administration was able to then fund this fecal sludge dumping site from that funding. And so it was something that didn't come from the members of the collaborative themselves. In other cases, there was, I mentioned a countywide monitoring database. So even though the county government themselves, all the non-governmental organizations working in that county would ultimately be using the database, the ones actually funding the database was external, was from USAID, or from SWS actually. And so it looked different in a lot of cases. I think that the main point or lesson that's coming out of it is that there's, in a lot of guidance, there's expectations for the members themselves to front a lot of the costs for the activities that they decide should be done or implemented through the collaborative. But in reality, that's just not possible in a lot of scenarios. And so the external funding for activities, I sort of clarified this when I was going over the definition in the slide, but it's more than just funding the meetings. It's more than just funding the hub entity. It's more than just funding some data collection or learning events. It's actually having some funding from some source that's not the members themselves to fund those activities.
Great, thank you. So a question from Rebecca, for maybe either of you, Sean or Kimmy. Did you find any significant influence on progress of the distribution of authority or resources from national to local levels? So, like, for example, was progress easier if the local government had more autonomy versus being very closely tied to the national level?
Yeah, that's really interesting. We weren't able to look at that. Our cases spanned a lot of those different levels, but I think we weren't really investigating the amount of autonomy. I sort of mentioned this, one of the quirks of the method that we are using is that if all of our cases were had a condition or a factor that was relatively present to the same degree in each case, so like autonomy, then we couldn't really look at the role that it played. And so, yeah, that's not really something that we could look at. Sean, I don't know if you wanted to comment on that.
Just have one thought, which is that I think there's a broader lesson that might apply, which is that it's really important that you have the people who have decision-making authority and who sort of own a piece of whatever outcome you're trying to produce. And so I think you can imagine if there was more local autonomy, then you might have more of the key decision makers accessible and nearby. So that's something that you could say. But I would say a lot of the cases had a really good presence at the local level where we were looking, but then we're also doing work at the national level, and we're able to sort of work both sides of that, raise awareness, and push. So I think that's one of the reasons why some of the cases were successful, but not something we have a direct evidence of in this study.
Great, thanks. Another clarifying question on the results you showed around the pathways. Is one pathway more important or efficient than the other? And could someone use all of the factors present in all of those pathways?
I love that question. No, that none of them are more important than the other. They all were reliable ways to make progress, but we didn't see one as being better than the other. You know, there's a lot of I'm sure people would have opinions about some that are better than others. You know, generally, you know, there are some, you know, being reliant on external funding. Two of our pathways were reliant on external funding. That can create some dependencies and might not be as sustainable in the long term. You know, I mentioned early on that our cases, we were only looking at 3 years of activities. And so, you know, as you start to get into cases that are working over the course of 10, 15 years, having, you know, relying on external funding might not be the best option. So there are definitely arguments that could be made one way or the other for which pathway might be better suited for which context, but none of them were more important than the other.
Great. Yeah, and I think as a plug for future work, as Sean mentioned up at the top, you know, we are working to assess some of the costs and benefits of collective action. And I think as we dive into some of those costs, you might see more about which of these factors might make sense given both context and effort required to achieve them. But it's not that one is a better pathway than the other. It will depend on context.
One quick thing to add is that you can be in multiple pathways. You could aim to do many of the factors. Some are a little bit binary, and that you can't do collective problem identification and at the same time be scaling a predefined approach. But there are lots of factors that you could engage at the same time.
Great, thank you. So I want to ask one last question to sort of lead us into the next section. We had a comment about collective problem identification versus collective problem alignment. So alignment, being that everyone agrees on the problem, but can you explain, Kimmy or Sean, what we really mean by collective problem identification and how that's different than just aligning around a problem?
Yeah, Sean, do you want to take this one? I know this is something you think about a lot.
Sure, yeah. Really what we're looking at here is more the starting point for collaboration. All the teams obviously identify a problem or a focus area to work on. But some are scaling something that either already exists or maybe they have already applied somewhere else and they're trying to bring it to a new area. But even when you're doing that, you have to engage the stakeholders and sort of get alignment on, yes, this is a problem area that people want to work on. Yes, this is a solution that people want to engage with and participate in, and you have to have that alignment. If you don't, then yeah, you're going to be, what do they say, pushing on a string. It's not gonna work. But then there are situations where maybe there's a variety of things you could work on, or maybe there's some disagreement amongst stakeholders amongst what to work on, and starting that the collaboration with an exploration of the context and the priorities and the problems might be more appropriate for that context.
Great. Well, thank you both for the presentations and the Q&A here. And thanks everyone for all the great questions coming in on the chat. Sean and Kimmy, feel free to answer things in the chat that can be answered. We will also have some Q&A at the end with our next three speakers who may address some of these questions that we haven't gotten to yet. So thank you, Sean and Kimmy. And with that, we're going to shift a bit to hear more about how this is working in practice on the ground. I'd like to introduce three speakers. We have short recorded presentations from each of them. Martin Musisi is the Regional WASH Advisor for IRC Uganda. He has more than 10 years of professional experience implementing participatory approaches in all phases of development initiatives. Then we'll hear from Muhammad Ibrahim, who is a Systems Change Advisor for SWS in Ethiopia. He's been working with IRC WASH and Tetra Tech since April 2018 in several of the program locations in Ethiopia. And finally, we'll hear from Cliff Nyaga, who's a WASH systems researcher with SWS partner University of Oxford, and he is the director of FundiFix, a Kenya-based social enterprise that provides rural communities with a professionalized repair and maintenance service to guarantee reliable water access. And please feel free to type questions into the chat as they speak. They'll all be able to come in live after the presentations to answer questions. With that, Katie, if you can play the video.
Martin Musisi from IRC Uganda, sharing with you a collaborative approach on wash issues in Kabarole district. Kabarole district is one of the rural districts in Uganda with a population of 325,000 people, and unfortunately only 58% of this population is covered with improved water sources. And worst of all is that only 59% of these water sources are functional. Faced with such a challenge, the District Wash Stakeholders Forum that met on March 22nd, 2017, formed the Kabarole District Wash Task Team. This is composed of local politicians, technical staff at the district and the sub-district, journalists, private sector like bankers and mechanics, civil society organizations like local NGOs and international NGOs like IRC Uganda. In fact, IRC is the dedicated facilitator of this team. This was created with a mandate to think outside the box, to provide strategic direction for Kabarole district to gain universal wash access. And a number of things, positive things, has so far come out of this collaboration. This has enabled political engagements at various forums to proactively and positively contribute to sustainable wash services, as well as also stimulating community engagement to determine their wash needs and contribute to sustainable wash services. The local government, which is the engine of service delivery, has also had its capacity built, especially in the department of the district water office. And one major accomplishment has been a visioning tool that has been created, which is popularly known as the Kabarole District Wash Master Plan 2018-2030. I want to share with you that these did not come out of the blue. It came out of analyses of the wash systems in the district using the factor analysis, using organizational network analysis, and that's how the three factors have come to be the drivers or the strategic direction for the Kabarole District Wash Task Team, namely the local government capacity, the political and the community engagements. I want to end my presentation by reflecting on how the collective problem identification came about. There are three benefits that I want to share with you, especially generating commitment and buying in to focus on a given area, including government being involved in wash needs. The other is that collective problem identification allows local actors to define problems, especially for their local context. What fits in a rural district setting like Kabarole? And lastly, also having IRC, which has had a long stay in the district, to lead the facilitation of the stakeholders. This did not come without risks. Some of them include the exploration process, which was a little bit uncomfortable and unfamiliar, taking too long. Also, for the stakeholders who are used to quick actions and the quick wins, like a construction of water sources or infrastructures. And the problem of WASH is complex. It required us to explore multiple problem areas, and it became difficult to have a focus on a particular solution. Thank you very much. Over to you, moderator.
Hello, thank you. This is Mohammed Ibrahim. I'm going to present the experiences and learnings from South Ari Learning Alliance. As you see from the map, South Ari Warada is one of the 4 SWS pilot areas in Ethiopia. The 2 small towns, Debre Birhan and Waliso, focusing on sanitation, and the 2 rural waradas, Mille and South Ari, focusing on the rural water supply. South Ari is one of the 11 waradas under the South Omo zone in southern part of Ethiopia. The warada has a population of more than 280,000. Its water access is 26% based on the baseline assessment inventory. From these, only 2% of the household connection managed by gather utility, and 35% of the rural water schemes managed by the water user associations. Next slide, please. Looking at the history of the Alliance, South Ari Warada Learning Alliance is a platform composed from the local government waste sector offices, non-governmental organizations, and community representatives. The first establishment meeting was in November 2017, following different baseline assessment, presentations, and discussions. IRC has a dedicated hub facilitator at Zone Center to support the Learning Alliance activities and its process. In 2018, the Warada rezoned into 2 new additional smaller Waradas. Following this, the Learning Alliance split into 3. The 3 Waradas Learning Alliance organized 4 meetings together at Zone Center, aiming to share experience between Waradas. This was at the 6th Learning Alliance meeting. In its 9th meeting, the Alliance decided separately to organize their meetings in their respective waradas in order to practice by themselves. When we look some of the outcomes, the WASH stakeholders' understanding increased on WASH system strengthening, water scheme monitoring system in place, capacity of water user associations strengthened, awareness of water users improved. As a result, willingness to pay and water fee collection increased. Communication between water body management bodies, water user associations, and water office improved. Next slide, please. How the Learning Alliance focus area selected. IRC WASH, with the involvement of Warada stakeholders, conducted different baseline assessments to start collaboration with the local government. Following the baseline assessment, consecutive discussions organized on the findings and recommendations. Then the Learning Alliance identified and prioritized their problems. Upon the agreement on the assessment report discussions, the Alliance decided that strengthening water scheme monitoring and maintenance system as a focus area. But Warada WASH master planning idea emerged during an experience shared from another project in Amhara region, MWA. This was in the 6th Learning Alliance meeting that motivated the Alliance to develop their Warada WASH master plan and established planning team. Currently, the plan was finalized and approved by Warada administrator and the WASH sector offices. Next slide, please. Working with the government. IRC WASH signed a memorandum of understanding between region, zone, and Warada at the beginning of the project. Terms of reference also developed structurally to guide the Learning Alliance activities during the 3rd meeting. The terms of reference clearly show roles and responsibilities of Alliance steering committees as well as the project SWS serve as a secretary. For each Learning Alliance meeting, the steering committee members prepare presentations on the progress of agreed action plans from the previous meeting and an update within the Warada Wash sector offices. If the Alliance need financial and technical support from the project to implement its plan, like capacity building, training, and others, Warada Water Office requesting IRC Wash officially on behalf of the Alliance. Next slide, please. As a reflection on the collective problem identification as benefits, collecting data through the involvement of local wash stakeholders provide an opportunity for quick wins and generate buy-in. And also facilitation and combining power highly determines the successfulness of the coalition. As a risk on the problem identification, consensus solutions may fail outside of the scope of the project or the resource of the funder. Learning Alliance approach can drive change, but need institutionalization within the local government structure. External initiators highly contribute to internalize within the government system. Thank you.
My name is Cliff Nyaga, and next I'll take you through SWS program work in Kenya on supporting an existing collective action platform, the Kitui Wash Forum. For Kitui, our approach was slightly different and involved advocating for an existing solution in response to the county's sustainability challenge. To introduce the study area, Kitui is one of the 47 decentralized governments in Kenya with a constitutional mandate for ensuring universal water service access to its population of about 1.2 million people. Roughly 86% of the county's population is rural and relies on more than 3,000 rural water points. Operational sustainability of these water points is a key challenge, and this is mostly driven by a high non-functionality, with up to 40% of the mechanized sources not working. We therefore sought to demonstrate the Fundifix model, which is a professionalized repair and maintenance service model for rural water points. And we had an explicit goal here of influencing policy and practice on maintenance. Next slide, please. To give you a brief history of SWS program work and the collective action platform in Kitui, the Kitui Wash Forum began in year 2016 with the support of UNICEF Kenya, and the goal was to ensure coordinated planning of wash actors working in the county. Initially, the forum mostly comprised of government and NGO actors. Then progressively, with support from SWS program, it has expanded to include academia, private sector, education, and health actors. SWS program support to the Kitui Wash Forum started in year 2017, with most of the advocacy work happening over 2017 to 2018. Therefore, the starting point for this collective action platform was slightly different when comparing to the aforementioned alliances in Uganda and Ethiopia, as it involved influencing an existing but nascent platform. Next slide, please. When we joined the Wash Forum in 2016, our top objective was to explicitly elevate the profiles of sustainability more broadly, but more specifically, that of rural water maintenance. So how did we achieve this? First, we openly and consistently shared Fundifix models performance data with the quarterly Wash Forum meetings. That was to show that rural water functionality issues can be addressed, and also to highlight other sustainability issues beyond maintenance, including factors such as governance, funding, and policies. Second, we reinforced this by completing various system analysis activities. One of these was a county-wide diagnosis of more than 3,000 rural water points to again highlight sustainability issues. Third, we moved to support the Wash Forum meeting structure and even facilitated a sustainability session to stimulate high-level debate on key issues, again in an effort to drive consensus. So how was decision on key themes of focus arrived at? This was largely a consensus-driven process following a series of debates at the quarterly meetings. And separately, we confirmed the focus areas through our M&A framework and subsequently also aligned our support to focus on those top themes. For instance, through surveys and interviews, we were able to confirm that actors prioritized water policy and professionalizing rural water services, with a lower rank for factors such as service monitoring, water quality, and private sector participation. Next slide, please. To conclude, we've learned 3 things from the Kitui WASH Forum with respect to the starting point of collective action. First, we've learned that system analysis and evidence basis needs to be credible, and this is to enable debate to progress to the next stages. Second, we've learned that facilitating structured debate and making sure that you have repeated messaging of key results and findings is key in elevating the profile of the key issues. Third, we've learned that credibility of the key partners is key. For our case in Kitui, credibility of Oxford University and UNICEF Kenya was key in ensuring that there was trust, there was influence, a lot of influence among the actor group and within government, and also in ensuring that there was funding for the WASH Forum meetings to ensure consistent dialogue. There are some notable key benefits of a demonstration approach that was taken in Kitui, including that first, you may have ready results from the demonstration or from the pilot of your solution, which often provides some assurances to the actors. A second benefit from this approach is that you may also achieve faster progress due to a less intense problem definition stage. On the other hand, this approach may present some risks, and these include that first, it requires buying in and convincing of actors that the approach is scalable and adaptable. Second, in some circumstances, it may appear to be self-serving or promoting self-interest. Third, there may be other inherent perceptions or barriers to your proposed solution. And here, for instance, in Kitui, we observed a consistently low popularity of the factor of private sector participation. Thank you, and I will now hand it over to Liz.
Great. Thanks all 3 of you for those presentations. Apologies to anyone if the slides were a bit blurry as you were watching those videos. We will be posting the full slide deck on the SWS page on globalwaters.org. So if you weren't able to read those clearly, they will be available later. We'll take some time now for some questions to each of our 3 presenters. Please feel free to keep typing those into the chat, and we're monitoring that for more questions. I'll start with a question for maybe each of you to answer, and that's why did your team decide to use the selected approach for identifying the problem? So why did you either decide to go with a collective problem identification process, or why did you decide that demonstrating a model would be the right approach? I don't know, Martin, do you want to kick us off?
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, everyone. For Uganda and Kabarole, I think WASH and the timing actually also dictated the issues, because that was on 22nd, which is the International Water Day. And in the WASH Stakeholders Forum, the main focus actually was how do we get out of this problem of having only 58% of the population accessing improved water sources, and the majority of the water sources actually also not functioning. And faced with the challenge that we cannot reach SDG, achieve SDG 6. I think everybody was concerned, and the approach was because we are faced with such a huge problem, and we needed to delve deeper into what exactly does that mean and how do we get out of it. So we did not have way to get out of such a big problem, and we needed to find strategies and solutions. So we couldn't start with demonstrating an approach, but to explore deeper on the problem and find ways of overcoming it. That's, I think, the selection of the approach was natural in that setting.
Great. Thank you.
Back to you, Liz.
Cliff, from the other side, can you talk a little bit about why your team went with the approach of demonstrating a model?
Yes, to come over it, Liz. From our side here in Ethiopia, the project did a lot of baseline assessment, but not with the project only, with great involvement of the local government. Even the local government staff themselves collected data in order to make the data reliable by themselves and to take the government as their own data and report. But the analysis, of course, expert-based report produced and back to the local government in order to discuss and collectively agree, identify the problems and discuss and agree in all of the problem identification and prioritization and deciding of what actually they prioritize and focus for the sustainability of the water services. So in that context, as we know at the local level, there is no, of course, it's an administrative data is there, not a scientific based real-time data for the local government. So we supported that, and based on that, they collectively agree and decide what they want and proceed to the next planning and actions. Thank you.
Great. Thanks.
So for Kitui, I think one of the big influences was the fact that we had been working in the county for quite some time, since year 2013. Initially looking at issues around rain water functionality, then work evolved to smart monitoring of hand pumps to see, just to understand the dynamics of making sure that they are repaired on time. And by the time the WASH Forum was commencing in 2016 with the support of UNICEF, we already had an active maintenance service enterprise working in the county, which was already generating the evidence. And so there was sort of much of timings. In the early days, the focus of the WASH Forum at the very early days was on joint planning by WASH actors and also on reporting. So we saw it as an opportunity to essentially strengthen the forum. Number one, to have a strategic focus on issues around sustainability, but more specifically, we wanted to increase focus on maintenance of rainwater sources. The small hand pumps and size pipe systems, which comprise more than 1,500. We have more than 1,500 of them in Kitui. And so we had an interest in seeing that profile of maintenance gets on top of the list, and that becomes part of the solution to the sustainability challenge. So that's how that evolved. Over to you, Liz.
Great, thank you. And a question, I think specifically for Cliff, follow up. Can you share more information about how you got the partners in Kitui to overcome the perceptions of private sector as a risk factor?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. So one of the things that we consistently observed in the WASH Forum meetings and through our various monitoring activities, that's interviews and surveys, there was a general perception that private sector comes in to make profits from the sector. And so actors were very cautious in the early days in speaking out and in terms of opening up to the idea of private sector participation in rural water services, setting issues around affordability and all that. So, I mean, we again made a deliberate decision to operate the Fundifix maintenance service under an open book policy, if I may. And that is to say that we shared all the performance information from the technical operations in terms of repair time and staffing and field logistics to financial performance, ideally showing how much money is coming in from user payments or from the communities, and the funding issues. And the truth was that actually Fundifix was experiencing funding gaps not necessarily making any single coin as profit in Kitui. So I think opening up and showing the data from actual operations really helped. It helped the sector understand, the sector actors understand that private sector does not necessarily mean that you're making a profit, but it could have the other meaning could be that you're doing things more efficiently, and a performance-based model, which the county government can come in to subsidize, if I may. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So we've had a lot of discussion going on in the chat window about government uptake. And we noted from the earlier presentation that that was the one factor that was really necessary across all of the pathways to achieve success. So I wonder if Martin and Mohammed, you could talk a little bit about how the government was part of the collective problem identification and how that helped. And then in your case, if you could talk a little bit about how you engaged with the government as you were demonstrating the model to get their uptake.
Thank you, Liz. As I said in my presentation, the government plays a central role, whatever the shape it has. There was also a question about maybe investigations on corruption and maybe relationship to corruption and other maybe governance issues. But whatever the case may be, government in whatever color or their challenges they face in terms of governance, government still plays a central role in the WASH service delivery. And when we talk about the local government under the decentralization approach in Uganda, that we are talking about the district local government. So for our case in the Kabarole, actually the whole initiative was nearly started by the district local government wanting a dedicated team, which now turned out to be a learning alliance that will have more time spent on WASH issues, because the government has other areas of service delivery that they touch health, they touch roads and agriculture and other things, and they are not providing enough time to WASH issues. So that central role, I think it's very important that all decisions buy-in from government. So it's a very important factor that we all have to work towards in all those pathways. That's why you see that it ends in government uptake or government embracing these decisions. And for Kabarole, even just an acceptance, an acknowledgement of the role of the WASH task team and its products, for example, the district WASH master plan, is something that was very important, because outside government, you cannot easily implement it, because this is concerning a public good, which is WASH. Thank you.
Yeah, just to add what Martin is saying, of course, it's a similar case. The government uptake is very critical to achieve what we plan for the sustainability of WASH services. But it's not easy to get 100% of the government uptake. For example, whatever we or the coalition planning or deciding to focus as a priority, of course, it's a challenge of the local government, whatever. But there was a lot of interest and a problem within the WASH sectors. The water sector pulling the rope towards to their office, the health office too, and the education and other offices, willing to pull the rope to all the activities towards their office. But collective action or collective identification or decision of the problem is very important in order to get all sectors buy-in. Unless we may not get collaborator through our journey. So involvement of the local government, even from the beginning, from the planning stage, as I said before, through collection data, if possible, in reporting analysis process, and also discussion on the prioritization and problem identification is a very critical step in order to get government uptake. So everyone through the project is take care of that in our journey of the SWS project. So, for example, even currently, I was on the district to facilitate the Learning Alliance here in South Ari just yesterday. They are very happy in their journey, but SWS is on the way to phase out, but they are happy to continue by themselves all the activity what they learned, but they searching for financial source for the activities that the coalition is planning, unless they clearly learned about what they as a coalition, as a collective action decided to strengthening the monitoring and maintenance, especially the maintenance of the rural water schemes by caretakers or water user associations. Thank you. I'm handovering to Liz.
Great, thanks, Mohammed. Cliff, it looks like you might have dropped briefly. I don't know if you're here and you want to comment on the government uptake piece.
Yes, yes, thanks for that question. Yeah, so for Kenya, I think the context is that water services delivery mandate is decentralized, and regional governments, that's counties, fully responsible for ensuring universal water access. We deliberately chose to work with government and reinforce government's role in the collective action, for the reason that, as Mohammed mentions, the government is the only permanent, the mostly permanent actor in the collective action platform. One of the observations we made through the ONA process was that when we started the work in Kitui in 2017, non-governmental organizations were most influential. But come the endline ONA in 2020-2021, a number of them had closed out their programs. And so that actually highlights the risks of not having government uptake. The fact that then if you want sustainability, if you want continuation of initiatives, then the government is the permanent institution there. The government has mandate, and it's a permanent mandate, and therefore making sure that efforts make the government stronger and not necessarily create multiple centers of power, then that works best in terms of long-term uptake of interventions and also long-term sector sustainability. Over to you, Liz.
Great, thank you. So we only have a couple minutes left here. I'm going to ask the panelists one more question before we go, but I just wanted to mention that we would like to hear your thoughts about this webinar and use it to improve for the future. So there'll be a link in the chat to a post-webinar survey. If you could take just a minute or two to complete that, either as we wrap up here or right after, we'd really appreciate that. We definitely want to hear your feedback. So with that, I'll give each panelist just a minute here to answer one final question. So this final question came in from Jane. what assumptions or expectations did you make regarding participation and support from political, technical, and civil society teams in the districts or county where you were working? So please go ahead and take the chat that, go to the link that KD put in for the post-event survey, and with that, I'll turn it to Martin to answer that final question.
Thank you, Liz. My take on that is that wash issues or water is actually and requires a multi-stakeholder kind of approach. So based on that, the assumption that was made was that everybody has something to contribute from the private sector, from the government, political and technical, civil society, among others. But I think that's it, that everybody has something to contribute to actions, solving problems, and finding this complex issue of WASH.
Maybe a small point on it is collective action or learning alliance may answer the question, because the learning alliance is a coalition or a platform to do together to fill the gap for the WASH sector for sustainability. Without the political commitment or the political leader, without their participation, it's still difficult to get budget, to get decision, to get direction for whatever we planning to, or the Learning Alliance planning to implement. Without the technical experts, without the partnership, of course, SWS is a system strengthening project. Without partnership or NGOs or CSOs or enterprises or private sectors that working on the infrastructure, still difficult to achieve whatever the Learning Alliance is planning. So generally, what I want to say is Learning Alliance is a solution for that. Thank you. Over to you, Liz.
Great. Cliff, any final words?
Yeah, I mean, for Kitui, again, influencing the politicians was a key factor, and that mostly because they are responsible, number one, for approving budgets for water service provision in the county and also in other counties. So we have a county level parliament that handles budgeting and law or policy change process. So again, to influence policy change, we would have needed to work through them. And so our assumption was that they would be part of the collective action platform in Kitui. I mean, over the 3 years, some of the takeaways from our side were that most of these politicians were not engaged, and therefore there's an opportunity to further understand what incentivizes their involvement and their motivation. The other factor, the other takeaway from our work in Kenya was that often the county level politicians aim for equality. They want equal treatment, and that applies for policies, for demonstration approaches like the maintenance model that you're working on. And so working around some of those dynamics is key in bringing them on board and seeing their support. So I would conclude by saying that there's an opportunity to actually try and understand further the factors and incentives that influence politicians' participation in such collective action approaches. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you all, Martin, Mohammed, Cliff. This was great. We really appreciate your insights. And thank you to everyone for all of the great discussion, questions. It looked like there was a lot going on in the chat. We are unfortunately at the end of our time, so we want to let everyone go either to the rest of their day or their evening. Please take a look at the SWS page on globalwaters.org. I think someone can put that into the chat for us. And we'll have more information there on this topic and all of the other work that SWS is doing. Please also do take a moment to answer the very short closing survey about today's event, because we really do look forward to hearing your thoughts. So with that, thank you all and goodbye.